Hello, 40K fans. Welcome again to Captain Morgan's Librarius. I'm happy to welcome you here today to discuss a little bit of a deviation from our normal topic of conversation, though not too far. By the way, I am still accepting questions related to our last video/article, the interview with Dr. Nahamik. I would love to get as many questions as possible, so if you have any questions about mental health and the hobby, be sure to send them to me, Brother Captain Morgan at gmail.com, or via my Facebook page, Captain Morgan's Librarius. I'd love to have some great questions for Dr. Nahamik for round 2. But before we get into that, I want to say thank you and give a big shout out to Reese and all the people at Frontline Gaming who are constantly allowing me to barf all these words all over the website in the hopes that people enjoy them. So please take the opportunity to go to their website, read the article, read the comments, respond and interact. So today's video, though, is about something a little different. It's something that's been spinning around in my head for a little while, related to match play in 40K. I've read through the rules, of course, and I'm working on getting more and more practice in. But one of the topics that I've seen floating around the internet, conversations I've had with friends in the hobby, and just general game ethos and game philosophy, there's my tie-in. The 10 points that broke the gamers. Paint scores, the bane of every competitive player's existence. Art, so subjective and unquantifiable, has finally sneaked its way into mainstream competitive 40K. Whatever shall we do to combat this menace? For those of you who might be a bit confused, I am referring specifically to this lovely page in the Matched Play book. Page 12 of the 2020 chapter-approved Grand Tournament Mission Pack. What it means is that for Matched Play missions, players who satisfy the requirement of a battle-ready paint job get 10 points towards their final game score. That means that 10% of all potential points in a game are determined by whether or not, quote, your models are fully painted with a detailed or textured base, end quote. Since most games don't score up to the 100 possible points, that means that it's going to be generally more than 10% of your final score for most games in terms of what you're actually able to achieve on the table. The drama being that in a truly competitive game, who the heck cares if your army is painted or not? We haven't cared up to this point, and this certainly isn't part of this hobby that we all enjoy together. Or is it? I've seen a fair amount of frustration around this topic from players who don't like how quote-unquote paint scores sneak their way back into competitive play. Now, I've got to be completely honest here. I find the criticisms of this standard to be overblown, I find concerns about this standard to be unfounded, and I find its critics to be ultimately unconvincing. Some of the criticisms come from close friends and longtime local community members. Some of these also come from internet groups I've seen, YouTube videos, and other competitive sources have also talked about drama online related to this topic. It's not too hard to find if you go looking, and it's even easier to find people who actually like this change. Still, online debates continue on whether or not painted armies are important enough to 40K to matter in a competitive setting. This debate is fundamentally a question of game ethos and game design philosophy. That's where I get my hook in here. To Games Workshop, what does being a good matched play tournament player mean? Whatever it means is quantified in the form of points scored in a mission. The accumulation of as many points as possible is the aim of a player in a match play scenario. So the question of how players accumulate points becomes the manifestation of the game creator's philosophy by determining the methods through which a player can accomplish his or her goal. Additionally, this is also the foundation of the very broad social contract that applies to match play at home and tournaments as laid out in the GT Mission Pack. Now, can we just take a moment real fast and appreciate that GW has taken the time to more clearly formalize a social contract in this way? And no one can say that GW doesn't have the right to formalize it either. It's their game. This is especially true because we have been asking them to do this for a while. We have been asking them to get more involved and more supportive of tournament play, or at least the competitive players have. Now, my big thing is I don't really pick sides when it comes to the ways you play the game. I enjoy playing narrative games with close friends and family. I enjoy going to tournaments, meeting new people, enjoying the social aspect of the game, playing armies I've never played before. I find a lot of fun in match play scenarios, and they each have their own stresses and their own different sets of expectations depending on who you play with. Now, games with my dad, for those of you who don't know, I've been hobbying and painting miniatures since I was about 4 years old. That doesn't mean that I'm extremely talented at it. What it means is my dad, efficient and smart, saw a bored 4-year-old boy and had a bunch of unpainted Napoleonic horses that he had cast out of pewter, I believe it was, and had me go to town on them. That meant a lot of black, brown, and gray paint, but the horses got painted. He just touched up the details. So when I'm playing a narrative mission with my dad, or any kind of mission really, we care a lot about the aesthetics. Growing up, if it wasn't painted, generally speaking, it didn't belong on any of his tables. And if you saw any of his tables or any of the terrain that he makes, you would understand why. But this is a conversation about match play, so I'm not going to go off too much on what the different design philosophies are for the other kinds of play. What does this particular, then, match play design philosophy exactly represent? Well, it means that to master Match Play 40K, as GW has defined it in the 2020 GT Tournament Mission Pack, 90% of your game is gaming skill and 10% is hobby skill. 10%. Not 20%, not 40%, just 10. And that 10 is considered satisfied by a very realistic and achievable hobby standard. No grand conversions or peerless painting skills required, just a minimum baseline effort to get the entire army painted. Let's say that again. The entire army just needs to be painted. So for those who use Games Workshop Standard, which is going to be pretty much every major tournament in the world so far as I can tell, this becomes the ethos that the community of attendees is trying to live up to, and this is the goal we are all competing to attain mastery of. The standard consists of, again, 90% player skill and 10% for a painting standard out of the 100 potential points. It's not even 10% to the person with a better paint job. You're not competing to see who is the best painter. It is 10 points to each player who satisfies this, once again, very achievable requirement. It's not even necessarily a ban on players who don't meet the standard either, or a model removal policy like we have at the Las Vegas Open, though I don't expect this standard to change for the Las Vegas Open because, after all, this is a destination event that people are spending hundreds, thousands of dollars to go to, depending on whether they're driving, hotel costs, airplanes, not to mention the models, tickets, whatever they're attending. I think it's also very telling that these aren't bonus points. So these 10 points are fundamentally integrated into each match play mission. So that further cements the idea that these points are a core fundamental idea of match play 40K for the 2020 season. It's also very easy to score. Is this army fully battle ready with painted bases? Check yes or no. It doesn't take a lot of time to calculate. It doesn't take away from any gameplay time. It's a simple yes-no. And the owning player also has complete control over the completion level of their army. From a competitive standpoint, these are basically free points. One of the reasons that the Recon secondary mission from the 8th edition ITC mission packet was so popular was because it was something that the player who owned his own army could generally control. It was something that your opponent, in most cases, couldn't block because it involved movement. Now, there were, of course, some extreme circumstances where you couldn't score those points because maybe you were completely dead, or maybe the opponent had somehow managed to fit a croûte along the edge of every single, whatever it was. There were some rare circumstances that existed in that situation, but generally speaking, it was an ideal secondary that was often took because it was very achievable, much like these 10 points. We have a lot of standards in this game. We have a standard of ethics, we don't cheat. We have a standard of manners, treat people with respect, and so on. It's all codified in the ITC Code of Conduct, formally for ITC events, but it is also a general standard of behavior. It's part of the more overall broad societal social contract, whatever you want to call it. If you want to be able to continue to play more games with more people, then you have to play the game in such a way as that people will want to play games with you in the future. So, a minimum pain standard is not so much a drastic deviation from the concept of having a baseline standard, and it isn't something that makes the game worse or is negatively gatekeeping. Every game is an investment for more than just yourself. You've committed to spending at least 3 hours with the person across from you. It's not such a hard ask to make it a halfway immersive experience for them by having your army finished. A minimum pain standard reward of 10 points that you just get, no matter how good or bad you are at the game, isn't really something worth complaining about, yet the complaints come. So, here are some paraphrased versions of criticisms I've heard and read so far on the internet. These come from real people. I'm not going to say who they are. If they see this video or read the article, they may recognize themselves. If so, have fun. I will take complaints in the comments section, but don't be surprised if you find that you've outed yourself as someone who makes some of these ridiculous arguments. Now, I will also be using somewhat of a caricatured voice for each of these questions. That's just an auditory tool for people who are listening and not reading, so they can understand who is making the complaint or making the argument versus my response to them. You may or may not actually sound like this, but I'm going to take the opportunity to have a little fun with it. So if you can't take a joke, you're going to have a bad day. Not everyone gets the same thing out of 40k. Some of us like to just game and don't care about painting. We shouldn't have to be forced to paint our models so we don't lose our games. I can accept that people get different things out of their hobbies. I don't play video games on their hardest settings, for example, because I have little time for video games and I don't like to spend time on difficult things without adequate reward. Now, the reward that I'm looking to get out of a video game is challenge and progression, but beating my head against a wall is no fun for me. Other people just love the satisfaction that comes from, hey, I did this really hard thing on a video game and I got this achievement. That's fine. Of course, keeping with that video game analogy, would you feel like you were ripped off if a game was missing a key part of the gameplay? Like, say, color? Now, some games, of course, artistically choose to live in a grayscale environment or use color sparingly, but that's a developer's choice and usually serves either the core narrative or some kind of gameplay mechanic. Think of a game like Hollow Knight. Now, imagine another game like, say, God of War, the most recent one from 2018, where developers felt it wasn't necessary to add color to the game because of a small minority of gamers who are only interested in the gameplay challenge itself or perhaps are colorblind. To more closely align with the analogy, what about a game like Fortnite? Does every player who spends money on their characters and their custom gear and their funny hats and their silly guns and do they all have to accept a loss of color because it isn't completely necessary for gameplay for a small minority of players? After all, you don't need color to play video games. Who would take that critique seriously, though? I mean, sure, God of War and Fortnite would work if they were PS1 level Lara Croft polygons in black and white, but would they be better that way? Could you really argue that decreasing the quality of the aesthetics for the sake of only what is necessary to play games enhances the game and the gameplay experience? Should a game company change its entire ethos to satisfy the demands of those groups of people who aren't interested in color? After all, It is the developer of Warhammer 40k who has decided that being good at 40k in the match play perspective means in part, and in a very small part, that you have to have a painted army. So, if you want to prove that you're good at 40k, then you need to paint your army. Even so, you can choose not to and just not take the 10 points. It doesn't disallow unpainted armies as part of the battle ready standard. I'm sure with your epic dice rolling skills you can score enough points to make that 10 points not even matter. I mean, if you're sure enough that your gameplay skill is that kind of level, anyway. Yeah, I don't have an artistic bone in my body. Why should I be held to the same standard as somebody who does? I shouldn't have to lose a game I won because of 10 stupid painting points I didn't get that my opponent did. Yeah, not everyone is indeed equally skilled at everything. For the life of me, I have a hard time with things like complex mathematics. I struggle to get the B and C grades I got in college level math. Programming was the same way for me. Some people in my classes just got it. I had to struggle for every line of code that I wrote. It felt unfair. Isn't it unfair that if 10% of competency in a job is determined by a baseline understanding of a subject, that if I apply for a coding job without competency or even minimum effort in that subject, that someone who does have that competency, or at least the bare minimum understanding, gets 10% more consideration than I do? After all, why should the most capable person at accomplishing the task get the job? Maybe we should expand on this concept, and we could just give bonus points to players in each game if their ITC score or if their tournament placing is lower than their opponents because they obviously don't have a competitive bone in their body. They just aren't as interested in tournaments as other people, or not as talented. They're not competitively inclined. So asking them to try and play to the same standard that everyone else does deserves kind of a handicap, wouldn't you say? I am, of course, being sarcastic. The painting half of the game is invading the gaming half. I don't demand that you play a game of 40k where you gain points towards armies on parade, and the reverse expectation should also be true. Okay, now this one is easy. Your fundamental error here is that the two halves of the game were not part of the same whole. Painting has always been a component of 40k. The separation between painting and gaming was only ever arbitrary to begin with. Now perhaps there was a time where there weren't enough 40k players to get together to hold a tournament without allowing people to bring unpainted armies, but those days are very long past. Also, anyone who has participated in Armies on Parade knows that you don't gain points in Armies on Parade. And you certainly don't get points from playing competitive games for Armies on Parade. It's a pageant and a bit of a popularity contest. People will bring their families in and have them vote, even though they may have never seen a painted miniature before, or, I don't know, they owe them money. Anyway, I suppose we should just resign ourselves to settle for your low standard of play experience because of what you do or don't demand over something that the game designer put in their game that you are voluntarily playing. Or not. I don't think that the victor of a game of dice should be decided based on who looks cooler while throwing the dice. Okay, first of all, as long as you shower and wear deodorant regularly and aren't breaking any laws, I don't care much how you look when you are actually rolling the dice. But joking aside, that certainly seems kind of reasonable, right? If the game company had not decided for you what the standard for victory entails. You do, of course, remain free to set up your own standard of play, but the onus then is on you to get people to show up. If you like events full of not a few people who aim very low and love the flavor of the month army anyway, hopefully they don't ruin it for everyone else who paid for the experience advertised on every box of models and in every rulebook for the game that has ever lived, a game of painted miniatures. Now that's another thing to consider. Every unpainted model in a game is a failure to deliver on an experience advertised on every box and in every picture. Inasmuch as the game is now supported by Games Workshop more, part of what they're selling to us is a game of painted miniature battles. I mean, I'm pretty sure it says that right in the book. For that reason, I think that even Rogue Trader tournaments or local store single day 3-rounders, however you want to put it, should follow this standard if they're going to charge an entry fee, because you're paying for the experience that was advertised on the box. I shouldn't lose a game because Hobby Track guy can highlight his models better. Okay, so the standard is battle ready, not who has the better paint job. It doesn't matter whose highlights are a microstroke finer. Highlights aren't even really necessary using the contrast method, at least the one that was on the page in the book. I also really love, and when I say love, I mean hate, how Hobby Track is used as a derogatory term here. Now this is for those who don't know, this is an ITC term. The Hobby Track is a competition for a best painted in the ITC season. So people who show up to tournaments, if they desire, can be scored on the Hobby Track and place and earn points for an end of season reward. Now, how patronizing can you get by looking down on someone who's also competing in the Hobby Track? Like, the effort that it took to compete on not just the gaming but on the painting side is some kind of a step down, or it's somehow worth less of an acknowledgement than a strictly competitive thing. Now, if anything, that would be more competitive, right? And by the way, if you are losing to Hobby Track Guy by within a 10-point margin, then you just might not be as good at the game as you think you are. More likely, you can't handle that not only can someone be as good at the game as you are, or even better, but they can paint well too. Perhaps you shouldn't have underestimated someone because of his or her paint job, being Mr. or Ms. Hobby Track. It's a classic Cain and Abel story. Cain hated Abel because he was successful and succumbed to resentment instead of changing his own behavior. Your argument is invalid. Paint your models, change your attitude, prosper.
This is only going to discourage new players from playing in tournaments. What about people who are testing new things in their lists and don't want to commit to making something until they know they want it?
Okay, so the first assumption in this assertion is that match play is only about tournaments. It isn't, though now it includes a lot of tournament concepts. Why? Well, because it's easier to have the way to play spelled out and decided instead of having to figure it out for yourself when you go to a game store. This makes match play convenient for pickup games and even maybe the default way of playing the game. Even so, why would a new player automatically be coming to a tournament anyway? What exactly is a new player? A new tournament player? Or a brand new player to 40K? What's going to appeal to, say, a Garage Hammer player interested in trying out a tournament for the first time? Maybe because they heard about it on a podcast they like. Well, I can tell you the answer is not going to be gray plastic on bad tables. What's going to inspire a new player, unsure about his or her painting skills, is going to be people with painted armies who are doing their best regardless of skill level. What's more encouraging to an unsure painter than seeing someone else who struggled but still finished painting his or her army? Now, even beyond that, what about seeing progress in somebody's army? What's more inspiring, seeing somebody that's got, pristinely painted miniatures all across their entire army, or somebody who, oh yeah, this is my Marine from 5 years ago, but look at this new one, and I progressed because I practiced. Now that's cool. That's hopeful. That's exactly what we should be encouraging. Considering the ways to play, it takes a bit of ego in the competitive collective unconscious in 40K to assume that not only is competitive 40K the main way to play, but it's also the default goal of everyone who enters the hobby to enter the competitive scene. It isn't. Tournament gamers are still far, far outnumbered by our friends playing games at home who we should want to join us. In my opinion, the attitude of competitive gamers is a greater deterrent to newer players than having achievable hobby standards is. Let's look at an example. If you look at the Las Vegas Open over the last 4 years, the paint standards have only increased, and so has player attendance. If this concern about having hobby standards were true, wouldn't player attendance decrease because of the painting standard, driving players away? Now, I've judged the LVO championships for years, including the famous Tony Got Tony'd game, and no one has ever told me that unachievable hobby standards make them less likely to play. Critiques of the game and critiques of the experience boil down to either other players' attitudes or game balance issues, mostly on the former. That's the reason I never got into Magic cards. Now, let me bring this down to a personal story. I remember paying money to attend my very first 40K event, the 3rd edition Black Crusade campaign. I don't know how many of you listening or watching were around at this point, but it was this big global campaign that GW put off to decide the fate of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. Now, it was a little hard for me to earn money as a young teenager, but I'd gotten there. I had the support of my parents. My dad dropped me off with an army. I spent the whole day there. It was going to be my first time I had ever played against Chaos Space Marines. Now, my experience there, I was appalled at the behavior of the Magic players who came in. So, with army set up, game underway, and over at the other end of the table resolving some rolls against my opponent, who was very patiently teaching me some things about the game, I came back to find that my deployment zone and many of my models had been shoved aside to make room for 2 quite smelly Magic players' games. After refusing to move when asked, I had to go to the store manager, who came over eventually and asked them to move. They did, but they took the opportunity to also move some of my things and hid them across the store. I haven't spent $1 on Magic cards since then because of that experience, and I don't intend to. I don't care how good the art or the gameplay is. I don't want to waste my time with people like that. And yes, I know that not all Magic players are like that. I'm sure that all of you experienced Magic players listening to this will tell me in the comments exactly how the Magic community is full of paragons of sportsmanship and hygiene, but that's not really the point. Their attitude, their behavior, and the way they presented themselves as people who play that game mattered to me. That first impression ruined the game for me, pretty much for all time. So yes, attitude, behavior, and the presentation all matter. Standards are not gatekeeping if done properly and can serve to actually enhance the experience for everyone around and even give players a goal to aim for. How is this a bad thing? Beyond that, I fail to see what part of a battle-ready standard precludes players from testing things out that aren't ready yet. You can play any game still with your unfinished unit, you just don't get the 10 points. If you're practicing at home or against people who agree outside of events to act as if it was painted, then you have no problem either. There's flexibility there for you, and testing really isn't an issue. Acting as if this is unfair to enforce even at a 3-round tournament level also sends a message that the player's time means less because it's a smaller event and they shouldn't be able to enjoy 40K as it was meant to be played and as it was advertised unless they travel somewhere and want to spend a ton of money at a place like the Las Vegas Open. This protestation acts as if striving for a gaming culture where people continually seek to improve all aspects of play is a bad thing that will make the game less appealing to new people. I think it's the opposite. I know better than many how life gets in the way of your hobby goals. Many, not all. And believe it or not, COVID-19 has been the least disruptive life event in the last year that has interrupted my hobby and goals for this year. That said, if I went to a restaurant and I ordered my meal and the chicken wasn't completely cooked, then I wouldn't consider that meal finished and I wouldn't want to eat it. I also wouldn't accept an excuse about it either because the chef got distracted because he'd had a rough year. Let's be clear though, not finishing your army isn't going to give somebody salmonella under normal circumstances. I don't know your life. But the comparison still makes sense that we don't accept incomplete things for what we invest in the vast majority of cases. At least certainly not things that are intrinsic to the experience of that product. And besides, anybody who's had con crud knows that you can go to a gaming event and get sick from it. So like it or not, the completeness of your army is part of an experience that others invest their time and money into, particularly when there are entry fees. In the instances where we do accept a finished product, such as an incomplete video game at launch that requires massive patches day one to make the game actually playable, it consistently causes us grief as consumers. In fact, I don't understand why we actually accept that as a thing. It just kind of happens and people still spend money on it. Now, I remember waiting for 2 years at one point to go buy a video game because it took that long for patches to fix the characters' faces in that game so they would not turn inside out and become floating eyeballs with dentures instead of fully integrated heads and faces. Anyway, painted armies on tables with painted terrain will absolutely encourage new players and maybe even inspire them, assuming your attitude about it doesn't discourage them. Paint points in a tournament event that requires skill are idiotic beyond comprehension. Games Workshop shouldn't put paint scores into my competitive games so they can sell paint at gunpoint. Okay, I've got to be honest here. I've been saving this for last because it's my favorite, since the person I'm paraphrasing has spent, to my knowledge, tens of thousands of dollars getting an army professionally painted. I think more than one even. So beyond not really having a reason to complain about this particular thing, they also, I don't understand. Okay, here we go. As a tournament judge and as a judge for the Las Vegas Open, calling you out there, Salty John, I can't wait until I get my official Games Workshop gun that I can point at people's heads, forcing them to paint their minis or die. I will be the Lord Commissar of Paint, and with my trusty Technicolor las pistol, I will shoot all who run away from their hobby tables and swim in the profits of my newly purchased stock in paint companies. Surely the 10 points are worth dying for, after all, and of course, it must be GW Paint only. That's where I should get my stock. After all, there are no other companies that make and sell paint, right? Oh, wait, there are? I guess I'll have to taste test them to be sure. I'm pretty sure my insurance covers whatever the consequences of that are. Yeah, okay. So, this argument is, of course, hyperbolic and ridiculous. We've already established in the course of this commentary that Games Workshop gets to decide what skill in match play 40k means, not you. We've also established that you can still play at the loss of those points, and if your skill is so great and if gameplay skill is so paramount to your perception of what winning means, then your skill should certainly eclipse the need for those 10 points anyway, at least until you can drop another 10 grand on getting someone skilled at painting to do it for you, for whatever it is you want to be painted next. And that'll teach those tyrannical paint pushers a lesson about what having real skill at competitive 40k means. I mean, can you hear what this sounds like? Don't get me wrong, I don't see a problem with commissioning someone to paint your miniatures. I have some very close friends who make or supplement their living significantly because of this. During college, I myself worked as a commission painter to supplement because I was going to school full-time, and I had a part-time job, trying to raise a kid, everything that's involved with that. And, of course, my friends are painters of superlative skill, and many of them are extremely competent wargamers who win Best in Faction awards for both gameplay and painting skills in the ITC. You know, because it doesn't have to be just one or the other. In fact, it's designed not to be one or the other. Forgive my sarcasm, I just think that your message here is a bit disingenuous because it sounds like you're claiming some kind of victimization or oppression for having to paint miniatures in a hobby about painted miniatures. I mean, even worse, you're claiming some kind of tyranny exists to force you to paint at gunpoint when your participation in the hobby is completely voluntary to begin with, much like your participation in any event that uses this standard. And you spent more money on getting models painted in the last 5 years than I've spent on the entire hobby my entire life. Who exactly is oppressing you? Forgive me if you're truly more concerned about the plebs who are around you, but I doubt that very much. Or is it perhaps more likely that you simply protest the game acknowledging what has been understood from its presentation right on the box and right in the rulebook for the entirety of its existence? That this is a game of painted miniatures and you just don't want to paint. Fair enough, you don't have to. You just have to accept the score limitations that come from your own reticence to do so. Those of us who don't chase the meta have understood this for a while. That sometimes doing things the way you enjoy means that you aren't always going to be able to compete as well as others. I suggest you take this lesson to heart. Whether you chase the meta or not, painting is now fundamentally linked to talent at Match Play 40K. And that's the way it should be. Now that feels better. That was a little cathartic for me. I hope that you hated or enjoyed all of my impressions. Believe me, the people who I am taking these questions from don't sound anything at all like that. I had kind of thought about doing something like a Skeletor or a Cobra Commander voice, but not quite well trained in the voice actor department. And after all, if you feel like I made you sound bad, always remember that I have my eternal falsetto, so you can just ruthlessly make fun of me for that in the comments below. Speaking of comments and interacting with the video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. I'd love to get more people involved in this conversation. How do you feel like this argument went? Was it an argument? Was it just me ranting? Was it a diatribe? Was I dismissing fair points? Tell me in the comments. Also, take the opportunity to check out my Facebook page, facebook.com/brothercaptainmorgan, and you'll find some of the more recent hobby projects I've been working on there. I'm still trying to figure out how to do videos for hobby progress, but I do post updates on my Facebook page all the time, so you can check out some of the stuff I'm working on. My most recent, I hate to call anything completed, but my most recent miniature is this guy. He is a librarian, of course. This is based off of the Wargames exclusive miniature I've made several customizations to. You can kind of see my progress on him in better detail on that Facebook page. And he is a Blood Angels librarian who is in the middle of casting the Blood Lance psychic power, a power that no one in competitive 40K takes. But this is for a narrative campaign I'm doing with my dad, and I wanted a custom librarian to represent me, so here he is. My most recent project that I'm continuing to work on is this guy, Chapter Master Ralderon from 30K. Now, I love this character, and I love this miniature. I love the 30K miniatures in general. I just think they have such great personality and character. And even their scale, while a little bit smaller than the more modern Primaris that everybody's so hyped about, no Primaris miniature has the level of detail and character that the Horus Heresy Space Marines do, or even many of the 40K tactical squads, even if the scale and the dimensions are a little bit more appealing. So anyways, that's the topic for another video. But if you want to follow along with my hobby progress, check that out. I've got a bunch of pictures of my Thunderhawk there as well, which I am planning on making a full video tutorial for, with some of the things I learned while working on that project. Either way, I really appreciate you sticking with me for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.